But this week, we're on our sixth stop on our second leg of the journey here, and we are obviously still in Missouri. And our sixth stop here along the way is a little town called Arlington. Any of you ever been to Arlington, Missouri? No, one of you, okay. And the question that I asked my son when we were doing our little video was, you know what Arlington is known for? And then I kind of said, you got to come Sunday to find out. Arlington, here's what Arlington is known for. Nothing. No, just kidding. Arlington, actually, it's very interesting. Arlington is a town that was actually kind of a tourist destination. It sat on a river, a Missouri River, the Little Piney River, and it became sort of resort area. And actually, you can tell back in the 30s here, they had built a couple of resorts in the area, and primarily people from St. Louis used to come down and visit here. But this was, and by the way, here's a couple of bathing beauties from the 30s there, looking over the pool. But I think the significance of Arlington to me is that Arlington is like a lot of towns and businesses on Route 66, and that is when the interstate was built, some of the interstate completely bypassed old towns on Route 66, and a lot of them just became ghost towns. And Arlington is one of those towns. So if you go there today, this is what the resorts look like. And by the way, if you can't read the sign, it's kind of humorous. It says John's Modern Cabins. So there you go. And this is what the resort looks like. So, so many of these little towns along Route 66 were just completely pretty much wiped out when the interstate came through. And I think it's kind of interesting to tie it into what we're going to be looking at today, because in the same way that the interstate brought ruins to towns like Arlington, I think what we're going to see today is what was it that brought ruin to the United Kingdom of Israel. And our corresponding book this morning that we're going to go through is the book of 1 Kings. 1 Kings it's pretty easy to remember this. If you can remember this little phrase, Solomon and the split, you can remember what's really contained in 1 Kings. And the first half of the book is all about the third king of the United Kingdom, Solomon, and we're going to see how he becomes king this morning. And then the second half of the book really is about what happens that splits the United Kingdom of Israel into two separate kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And really, it's no longer a unified nation. And frankly, it really never has been since this point in time in some ways. So this is the book that talks about that split along with Solomon. So two parts to the book, and we'll begin by kind of looking at part one here, and that is kind of what this book teaches us about Solomon. The book begins, by the way, with the very last days of David. And in the book, we're told that, that David is old at this point in time. And we read this: when King David was very old, he couldn't keep warm, even when they put covers over him. So his attendants said to him, "Let's look for a young virgin to serve the king and take care of him, and she can lie beside him so that our Lord the king may keep warm." This is kind of like David's electric blanket, okay? And here's what they did. Then they searched throughout Israel for a beautiful young woman and found Abishag. A Shunammite brought her to the king. The woman was very beautiful. She took care of the king and waited on him, but the king had no sexual relations with her. So again, her main job in David's old age, and so he's quite old by this point in time, is when they go out and they find this beautiful young Jewish woman. And by the way, does anybody know who this is? Okay, I won't tell you. She's a former Miss Israel. So I looked up beautiful Israeli women, so they would go out and anyway, and this particular one is now Wonder Woman. So anyway, just so you kind of know, Abishag becomes Wonder Woman, if you can kind of remember that. Anyway, so So she becomes his electric blanket, really, and then she plays the only reason I even bring up this little piece of the story is because she actually plays a pretty important role as we move on here. So David is old, Abishag, comes in, and then what happens is that one of David's other sons, Adonijah, who, by the way, was the younger brother of Absalom, so remember Absalom and what happened to him and how he rebelled against his dad and tried to overthrow David. Well, this is his younger brother, and he decides he's going to proclaim himself to be king and claim the throne. So we read, while Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, put himself forward and said, I will be king. Now, what you read in 1 Kings is that not only did he make this declaration, but he really had support to become king because he was supported by Joab. And remember, Joab was the commander-in-chief of David's armies, and so Joab allies himself with Adonijah, and he was supported by Abiathar, who was one of two kind of equivalent of high priests of Israel at that point in time, and so he really has some significant support behind him. Who is excluded out of this little incident is that they intentionally exclude Nathan, the prophet, who was the one that confronted David, and Zadok, who was the other of the kind of main priests of Israel at this point in time, and Benaiah, who was kind of right under Joab in the military, and the reason being that all three of those were going to remain true to David and who David appointed. So Adonijah proclaims himself to be king, and of course, this stirs up a lot of things because David has promised Bathsheba that it will be Solomon that will succeed him on the throne of Israel. So what happens is this. Nathan, when he hears about this, he goes to Bathsheba. And he asks her, have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, has become king, and our Lord David knows nothing about it? So Bathsheba then is going to go carefully inform David about this and remind him of the promise that he's made. So Bathsheba went to see the aged king in his room where Abishag the Shunammite was attending him. And she said to him, my Lord, you yourself swore to me, your servant, by the Lord your God, Solomon, your son, shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne. But now Adonijah has become king, and you, my lord the king, do not know about it. Well, quickly David comes up with a plan, and that is that he's going to immediately institute sort of an alternative coronation. And by the way, when you read the text in 1 Kings, it gives specific locations, and most of us aren't real savvy probably on biblical geography, wondering, well, where did Adonijah declare himself to be king? Because all of these people have come together and there's sort of a big celebration going on. And the spot that's mentioned in 1 Kings is simply, a few hundred yards away from the walls of Jerusalem. I mean, they're right there in Jerusalem. And then what David is going to do is he's going to have Solomon quickly coronated at Gihon, which is the spring that sits right up against the walls of Jerusalem. So all of this is taking place in very close proximity. And so here's what David does. He says, call in Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah son of Jehoiada. And when they come before the king, he said to them, take your Lord's servants with you and have Solomon, my son, mount my own mule and take him down to Gihon. And there have Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him king over Israel. Blow the trumpet and shout, long live King Solomon. And then you're to go up with him, and he is to come and sit on my throne and reign in my place. I have appointed him ruler over Israel and Judah. Again, they do this, and what happens now is that as they anoint Solomon to be king, there's a great celebration and noise that rises up at this point, and down in the other celebration, basically they're saying, well, what's going on? And they come to Adonijah and says, well, David just anointed Solomon king, and he's now sitting on his throne. And basically Adonijah, Joab, and Abiathar are in big trouble at this point in time. And so what happens now, Solomon's going to be king. Back in 1997, there was a made-for-TV movie on the life of Solomon. Ben Cross starred in it, so we'll use him as our Solomon today. Solomon then begins to consolidate his power. And initially, he doesn't really do anything to those that have, gotten behind Adonijah. But David dies, we're told, at this point in the story. David rested with his ancestors, was buried in the city of David. And Adonijah comes and persuades Bathsheba to go to Solomon and ask her, he's not the king, he didn't get the king, but would it be possible for him to get Abishag, right? So he wants to marry Abishag, and there's implications to all of that. And from Solomon's perspective, he views that as sort of a kind of a round, the corner, backdoor attempt to become king, because again, this was David's concubine, and the result out of that is that because of this request, Adonijah is put to death. Abiathar is removed from his role as priest and replaced by Zadok, and even Joab is put to death. And by the end of the second chapter of 1 Kings, sort of the summary statement that summarizes this is simply this, that the kingdom was now firmly established in Solomon's hands. And so the transition is a little rough, and again, you've got this whole kind of conflict that goes on. But by the end of the second chapter of 1 Kings, Solomon is firmly, firmly enthroned as the king of Israel. There's a couple of highlights I want to hit with you this morning in the book of 1 Kings. We won't be able to go through everything, but a couple of kind of well-known little episodes in the life of Solomon. The first has to do with how he became the wisest man that ever lived until the time of Jesus. And perhaps the wisest man ever except for Jesus, I guess you could say. And it takes place in chapter 3. He has an encounter with God. He's gone to sacrifice. Remember, the temple hasn't been built yet, and he goes up to Gibeon, which is not far from Jerusalem, and there's an altar there, and there he sacrifices to God, and as he is offering his sacrifice, God appears to him and offers him an opportunity. Ask for whatever you want me to give you. That's a pretty good request. I mean, that's a pretty good offer coming from the living God. Anything you want. What do you want me to give you? And Solomon, at this point in time, makes a great decision. And you probably know the story. Rather than asking for, fortune and fame and a long life and all the things that, you might think of when God would extend that kind of an offer to you, here's what Solomon asks for. He says, give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? God is pleased with this request, and he responds this way. He says, I will do what you've asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you've not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And this happens. Solomon becomes a fantastically successful king. Israel is flourishing. Solomon becomes perhaps the wealthiest man maybe that has ever lived on the planet when you put together all of the data we have, not only here but in some of the other books that Solomon shows up in. But he becomes this great king. And he has this wisdom that is so great that eventually people from all over the world are going to come to Jerusalem simply to sit at the feet of Solomon and to take advantage of his wisdom. The first episode of his wisdom is one that probably you all are familiar with, and it has to do with two prostitutes that come to Solomon, and they have a baby with them, and they both claim to be the baby's mother. And what has happened is that both of them have had babies, and in the night, one of the babies has died. The one prostitute is saying that the other one stole her live baby and replaced it with the dead baby, and they want Solomon, to make a decision about who gets the child. And Solomon's classic response, which again I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is he says, okay, how about this? Let's cut the baby in half, and we'll give half of the baby to each of you. Now, one of the prostitutes says, great, let's go ahead with that. That sounds like an answer. And of course the other one says, no, give it to her because, I don't want to see the baby killed. And of course, what does that tell Solomon? He suddenly knows who the real mother is, and the child goes to its real mother. And out of that story spreads. And as the story spreads, then, Solomon's sort of his renown begins to build. And again, in chapter 4, we're told that men of all nations then come to listen to Solomon's wisdom. So, that little episode is one of the highlights of Solomon's reign, how he gets wisdom to be a great king. The second kind of highlight of Solomon's reign, and this probably is the major accomplishment and what he's best known for in the history of Israel, is that it is Solomon that now finally builds the temple. Chapters 5 through 9 of 1 Kings all have to do with this. And let's see where I'm at here. We're told specifically when this begins. In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. That gives us a pretty good idea of some dates here, by the way. Roughly speaking, we think that Solomon began his reign right around 970 BC, and that his reign goes 40 years, like Saul's did and like David's did, till around 930 BC. And what we're going to see happen a little later, we can date right around 930 BC. It also tells us, by the way, if you go back and do the arithmetic, that the actual Exodus out of Egypt probably occurred around 1446. If 930 is accurate, then that would kind of give us an idea of when the Exodus takes place. But it's a 7-year project. And so from 996, when he begins the project, and he is the 4th year of his reign, all the way to 966. That's what I'm trying to say. 966 to 959, the temple is being built. When we get into Chronicles, by the way, and I don't know if I'll quite remember to hit on this, so I'll point it out. Chronicles is a parallel history, is what we're going to see. It has a lot in common with 1st and 2nd Kings. They sort of overlap. But one of the things that Chronicles tells us that Kings doesn't is that the actual plan for the building of the temple was given to David by God. And so there's a plan exactly how the temple is to be built. And the second thing that we're told in Chronicles that we aren't in Kings is that massive resources are gathered in order to build the temple. Staggering amounts of gold and silver and bronze and iron and fine stone and marble and precious stones are all, brought together for the building of this magnificent structure that eventually becomes known as Solomon's Temple. Chronicles tells us, and you can kind of add this up, Chronicles tells us that David himself gives 110 tons of gold to the project out of his own sort of reserve, I guess, and 260 tons of silver. So if you calculate that out in terms of current values of gold and silver, basically David contributes about $4.5 billion to the building of the temple. And it is going to be a magnificent structure, as we'll see in a minute. They also have to recruit workers, and if you add up all the numbers of both slaves and Israelites that are conscripted into forced labor, and those that are hired that have certain skills, and those that are called out to be over them, there's about 213,000 workers that work in some capacity, whether it's carving the stones from the quarries, bringing them to the temple, or actually building on the temple itself. And out of that, they build the temple, obviously. To kind of give you a little bit of a sense, remember, this was Jerusalem at the time that David conquers it, and we probably can assume that this early in Solomon's reign, it still is relatively probably looks like this. Remember that David had purchased the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite, and there he had erected an altar to stop the plague that had broken out, but also that had been designated the place where the temple would be built. Traditionally then, that site is up here on Mount Moriah. And Mount Moriah sits up just a little bit higher than Mount Zion, and we know that the second temple is built here. There is some debate over whether or not this is the site where actually Solomon's temple was and whether it was in another location, but generally speaking, the consensus of opinion is that this is the site where the temple will be built. Again, this is sort of an artist's conception of what Solomon's temple would have looked like. It's a little different than the temple at the time of Jesus, which was the temple. This temple will be destroyed. Temple will be rebuilt, and after the temple, the second temple is rebuilt, Herod will spend 46 years embellishing it, so that by the time of Jesus, it's a very magnificent structure. But it's all based on the same plan as the tabernacle was. And although there isn't really detail specified on the courtyard, the courtyard would have been the area surrounding what becomes the actual temple itself. And outside of this, kind of give you again an artist's little look and a cutaway, the altar of sacrifice would have been there in the courtyard, the laver, and there were a whole series of basins for cleansing and washing after the sacrifice. And then you get this picture, again, like the tabernacle, that the sanctuary itself would be divided into two parts. One would be what was called the holy place, and inside there is where the priests would day by day sort of carry out the duties of the priesthood. And then on the far left there, there was a smaller area that had been sectioned off and a veil put in front of it, and it was the most holy place, or what we know as the Holy of Holies. And into the Holy of Holies is where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. And there in the Holy of Holies, as in the tabernacle, in Solomon's temple, is where God is going to manifest a tangible manifestation of His glory in that part. And the priests cannot go in there day by day. It's a place that can only be entered by the high priest of Israel in only one day of the year, on the Day of Atonement, when he goes in, and there on the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat covering it, would there sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice for the sins of the nation. So you get sort of an idea again, how the temple is really sort of based on the same kind of a plan as the tabernacle was. Again, just about twice the size. And so in the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies was 15 feet by 15 feet by 15 feet. And in the temple, it is 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet, so roughly double the size. And then the furnishings of the temple that are brought in, much the same as in the tabernacle, the bronze altar outside again, the laver outside, inside lampstands, a little hard to see because it's small, but you can kind of see along the edges there in this drawing of it, that you have the lampstands that are lit continually burning there in the holy place, table of showbread that are around the altar also, an altar of incense, and the Ark of the Covenant. The most important thing about the temple, though, is this, that when they finish it, God shows up. His presence is the reason for the temple. Now, I just point that out because there is coming a time in the history of Israel where, because of their sin and disobedience, God is going to leave the temple. He's going to remove His presence. And suddenly it's just a building. But God isn't present anymore. And the scary thing about it, of course, is that everything goes on just the same as it did before. And so what you have is a dead religion now, because you're going through all of the motions, but God isn't present. And of course, that's always the great dilemma as we seek ways, to express our faith, is that somehow the expression becomes more important than the reality that we're trying to express. And the other thing is that we have no evidence whatsoever that at the time of Jesus, at the second temple, Herod's temple, that God ever manifested Himself there until Jesus Himself walks into the temple. And that's the first time that God is actually manifest there at the temple. So anyway, this is the biggie. And Ark of the Covenant's brought in. Okay, let me go here. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord. And the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the temple. God shows up. The rest of chapter 8, by the way, you should read. Solomon dedicates the temple. It's a real powerful part of 1 Kings. And then, the other accomplishments of Solomon's life, he major construction projects during his time as king. He restores cities that have been destroyed. He builds cities. He builds palaces. He just has massive kinds of projects going on during his kingship, and he amasses this massive amount of wealth. His income, again, we're told certain things that happen every year and other times when other amounts of wealth come in, and basically for 40 years, year after year after year, billions of dollars are coming in to Jerusalem and to Solomon, and he becomes perhaps again the richest man that ever lived. Now, just when everything couldn't be going better, guess what? Are you getting used to this? I mean, there's a pattern here. And by the way, think about this. I don't know of any other ancient civilization that when it writes its history shows the flaws of its rulers. They're always how great and their accomplishments and all of this. And it's so fascinating that the Bible is so honest that it always reveals the flaws of its leaders, and they just keep happening. And so here's what happens. Solomon, not unlike his dad, David, has women problems. His are a little bit different. From the standpoint that he begins to marry, and this again was not uncommon in the ancient world, marriages that created alliances, and Solomon begins to marry. And amazingly, the text tells us, here, let's read this first. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women. That's a little bit of what do you call the opposite of an exaggeration? Yeah, an understatement. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. We're going to see that's a little bit of an understatement, okay? Besides Pharaoh's daughter, who he had married, they were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them. Because, why? They will surely turn your hearts after their gods. And this is exactly what happens. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. See, guys, it happened even back then. All right, anyway. So, I can't barely handle one. How in the world did the guy handle 1,000? So, anyway, what we're told now is that Solomon gets off track. And it's, his wives lead him astray. He turns his heart after other gods. And there's this sense in which what he begins to do hardly makes any sense. And I think part of what goes on here, and I think this is an important takeaway for us, is that he's disobedient. Again, the text is so clear. He's marrying women he's not supposed to marry. And disobedience, it creates confusion. And this is true in our lives too, by the way. I mean, Solomon probably begins justifying all the things that he's doing because he gets kind of confused and he's off track again. And out of that, he begins to engage in idolatry and the worship of the nations around them, the very practices of the Canaanites that led God to wipe them out and give the land to Israel. And now Solomon is doing the very same things. And consequently, God says that the outcome of that is that the kingdom is going to get ripped apart. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. And although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. And if you add together how that sin and disobedience create confusion, then I think the other takeaway in the text is this, that confusion is going to create disaster. And it's going to lead to the destruction of a unified, united kingdom. And that's kind of what comes next in 1 Kings, so that Solomon eventually dies, we're told. I don't know if I got that text. Okay, I don't. Solomon dies, and we're going to see more about Solomon, by the way, because as you probably know, Solomon is the author of 3 more books that we're going to look at as we go through the Old Testament. He writes Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and Song of Solomon. So we'll kind of beef up a little bit more on Solomon when we get to some of those books. But the second part of the book of 1 Kings is the split of the kingdom, and I'm going to scream through this real quick, and then when I pick back up on the books of the Old Testament, I'll kind of finish out 1 and 2 Kings together. But here's what happened. Solomon's son is named Rehoboam, and he becomes the king after Solomon. Now, Solomon had an adversary by the name of Jeroboam, who was exiled away from Israel. But when Rehoboam becomes king, Jeroboam, this adversary, comes out of exile. And when Rehoboam takes the throne, Jeroboam comes along and he challenges him. And basically what he says to him is this, that, your dad, he taxed the heck out of us. And when you think about all of these amazing accomplishments of Solomon, they were coming at the cost of the normal, person of Israel under extreme taxation, and the people are worn out. And so Jeroboam comes along and he basically says, give him a break. Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. Well, Rehoboam goes to two sets of advisors. He goes to some of the older advisors of his father and say, what do you think? And they say, yes, lighten this deal up. The people have had enough. Give them a break. And then he goes over to some of his young buddies and he asks them the same question, and they say to him, lay it on heavier. And who do you think he listens to? He listens to the younger guys and basically says, I am going to lay it on. And the result is that Jeroboam is now going to lead the 10 northern tribes, and the United Kingdom is going to split. And eventually, then, this is what, as you're reading now from Kings forward, back and forth, the text is going to talk about so-and-so became king of Israel in such and such a year. And then you'll read so-and-so became king of Judah in such and such a year. And this is what the text is talking about, that there is no longer a united kingdom of Israel. There are two kingdoms now, a southern kingdom that's comprised basically of Judah and Benjamin and some Levites, because remember, the Levites are spread throughout the whole nation. And then the northern kingdom of Israel, 10 tribes in the north, and under the leadership initially of Jeroboam. And so this split takes place. Rehoboam begins to go to war. He's not going to let this happen. He wants to go to war, and God stops him. And what God says to him in the text is this: don't go to war, because this split is permanent. This is the way things are going to be from here moving forward. Divided kingdom. And it's a divided kingdom that now will last. It's around 930 BC at this point in time. Basically will last as divided kingdom all the way to 600 BC, although in the middle of that, in 722 BC, the northern kingdom, which we'll see happen a little bit later here, the northern kingdom is going to be attacked by the empire of Assyria and is going to be wiped out. And so that by the end of the Old Testament, after the Babylonian captivity and when the captives come back, there is only going to be a southern kingdom of Judah. And by the time of Jesus, by the way, every Jew that exists at the time of Jesus either comes from the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, or the tribe of Levi, because 10 tribes are going to be lost when we see what happens when the Assyrians conquer them. So in the split, the north becomes apostate. And I need to finish this up quick. Okay. Here's what happens. So remember, what David has done is he has centralized worship in Jerusalem. It's a unifying factor that from all the tribes and all over north or south, when people come to worship the Lord, where are they going? They're going to Jerusalem. Well, Jeroboam immediately realizes he has a problem. And consequently, he's going to create a whole new religion for the northern kingdom. And so he sets up golden calves at Bethel, which is the southernmost point of the northern kingdom, and clear up at Dan, which is the northernmost point of the kingdom. He sets up these golden calves, and I don't think I've got the text. Let me see if I do. Yes, I do. The king made 2 golden calves, and he said to the people, is it too much for you to go up to Jerusalem? Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Does that sound familiar, by the way? Do you remember at Mount Sinai? Okay, and Aaron makes the golden calf, and what is the statement he makes? Here is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. Well, we have the similar thing now here, and he begins to build altars throughout the land. He creates his own priesthood. He creates his own festivals, and what he is going to do is lead the north into unsalvageable idolatry. This is a list of all of the kings of Israel and all of the kings of Judah. Could you memorize that real quickly here? Because I need you to know it anyway. And here's the deal, why I shoot this up. Because in every case, when we start to look at the kings of the northern kingdom, every king, when he comes to power, the statement is going to be made that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so you've got an unsalvageable northern kingdom that in 722 is going to be destroyed. And whereas you have some good kings on the side of Judah, which will extend their lifespan till around 600 BC. So we'll stop here for now. We'll pick up on this and go hit the rest of 1st and 2nd Kings. Next week we'll pull over to celebrate Christmas on Route 66. Okay? Let's pray. Lord, a lot of lessons here in these texts, and particularly just thinking about how that when we come disobedient, Lord, when we fail to listen to the things that you've taught us and how you've told us to live, and the things we're to do, the things we're not to do, and Lord, that when we sin, it really does create confusion. It has a tendency just to make us begin to rationalize and justify and get ourselves into a lot of trouble. And we sure see that in Solomon's case. And then there are consequences that out of that confusion and the decisions that are made oftentimes comes disaster. And certainly in Israel's case, that was true, and that out of sin and disobedience will come the destruction of the kingdom, and now these two separate kingdoms that are going to have their own problems. So Lord, we just pray that you would use these things to encourage us and teach us and remind us and challenge us. And we pray this in your name, Christ. Amen.